Good morning. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. Of course, we welcome those who join us on our heritage.org website on all of these occasions. Would ask everyone here in-house, usually our speakers end up doing this, Steve, to make sure their cell phones have been turned off before they begin. It's always helpful. We, of course, invite questions or comments at any time, as those who are viewing the website wish to send, simply emailing us at speaker@heritage.org, and we will, of course, post the program within the next day on our website for everyone's future reference. Opening our discussion today is Steve Moore, who serves as Chief Economist here at the Heritage Foundation. He focuses on advancing public policies that increase the rate of economic growth to help the United States retain its position as the global superpower in economics. He also works on budget, fiscal, and monetary policy and showcases states that are getting their fiscal houses in order. He previously wrote on the economy and public policy for the Wall Street Journal and also served as a member of the journal's editorial board. He has served as senior economist for the U.S. Congress Joint Economic Committee. He has also been the founder of Club for Growth and served as its president until December 2004. Then, prior to joining the journal, he founded the Free Enterprise Fund to continue advocating for free market economic policy solutions. Please join me in welcoming Steve Moore. Steve?
Thank you, John. So thank you all for coming out this morning. I am very excited about this new book that Burt and Anita Folsom have written called Uncle Sam Can't Count, A History of Failed Government Investments from Beaver, Pelts to Green Energy. And we were just delighted to have the two of you come to Heritage this morning because of, not just because of this book, but so much of your previous writing that has really been so seminal in the area of economics. One of my favorite books of all time is Burt's book on the myth of the robber barons, which has really become a classic. And this book is destined to become a classic too. It is just so filled with riveting information about how government fails us over and over again when it tries to inject itself into the private economy. And so what we'll do is have Burt and Anita make some comments about the book, and then we'll have try to have a lively discussion about some of their ideas and some of their thoughts about how we get out of this kind of crisis that has been created by government intervention into the private enterprise system. So let me start with our first speaker, who will be Burt W. Folsom Jr. He is the Charles Klein Professor of History and Management at Hillsdale College and the author of New Deal or Raw Deal, The Myth of. He's also, by the way, I love that book too, about the New Deal. He's also the author of the book I just mentioned, The Myth of the Robber Barons, and also a book called FDR Goes to War, which was written with his wife, Anita. He has written for the Wall Street Journal multiple times, American Spectator, National Review, Policy Review, Human Events, and you've seen his writings all over the full spectrum. So, Burt, thank you so much for being here this morning. Congratulations on the new book, and we would love, a synopsis of your argument in the book.
Sure. Thank you. Is it okay if I?
Sure.
Yeah.
You're a professor, so you have to stand in front of you, right?
The professor has to stand, even though, yeah. Thank you. Anita and I are glad to be here. Stephen, by the way, did an afterword for the latest edition of Myth of the Robber Barons, kind enough to do that, and did a foreword for New Deal or Raw Deal. Excellent. Puts a lot of the arguments into perspective. I appreciate that. And Anita and I are both glad to be here and see you all here and talking about failed government subsidies. I look around, I didn't see shock on faces. I said failed government subsidies. So it surely must be an oxymoron. That couldn't really be something that happened. But the truth is that what we've discovered in our research is that although they exist, especially now in the realm of promoting economic development. In fact, Steve has a recent piece that shows that in the last 13 years, practically every one of the largest 100 corporations in America have been taking some kind of federal aid, some kind of subsidy aid. Anita and I did a calculation on this, and it totals, in the last 13 years, $3,000 a second, every second. And if you go back to the beginnings of American history, we see failed government subsidies occurring from the presidency of George Washington on to the present day. hence the subtitle, Failed Government, quote, Investments from George Washington to Barack Obama. No one has done a history of these failed subsidies. You get little mentions here and there of some of them, but they're not incorporated. Very few are ever mentioned in the textbook. And we thought, hey, let's talk about some of these, the big ones. Does anybody happen to know what the first, in George Washington's administration, the first industry to receive a federal subsidy? By the way, you'd think that sort of thing would be information that ought to be known, right? Yeah. It's the fur trade. The fur trade with Indians, right? The Native Americans are Indians gathering up beaver pelts primarily, bringing them into fur trading posts, selling for goods like knives or axes, maybe guns, pots and pans, sometimes blankets, these sorts of things. And then going out and doing more fur trading, and that kind of trade goes on. It was a big part of early American history. Now you might say, well, why, if it's going on and it's not being subsidized, why did George Washington subsidize it? Especially when Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution has a very narrow range of things the government can be involved in. And the answer is Washington said, yes, that isn't a good place for private enterprise, but this is an exception. In fact, it's kind of an emergency. The British are there on our borders in Canada. And the danger is the British Fur Company, the Hudson Bay Company, we're just a new nation. Our Northwest is still very much unsettled. And what would happen if the British come in and do that fur trade? They would encroach into Michigan and Minnesota, and they might come down into Ohio and Indiana. And our efforts to get rid of them in the Revolutionary War would be stifled, all because of fur trade. So what we need to do is subsidize, since fur trading is good, subsidizing will make it even better. We'll subsidize the fur trade. We will have a subsidized company. They will withstand the British on the Northwest Territory, and then we will be a free and independent nation. And so what we have is this subsidy for a fur company, and we have these forts set up to do fur trading with the Indians. Well, one of the interesting results of this is that the British encroachment occurs, especially where the fur trading government company is operating. And so you wonder, well, why is this subsidized company not getting the job done? Because Washington thought with a subsidy it would be big enough and strong enough to resist the British, and the British seem to be encroaching exactly where the fur company has its outposts. And we look at it, and you look at the incentives, how they change when the government gets involved. Once the subsidy comes into the fur company, they now are dependent on government aid, not their ability to trade effectively products with the Indians. For example, the head of the fur company was named Thomas McKinney, and he got the idea, well, the Indians will eventually need to assimilate. Why don't we help them on the process? So he bought, instead of buying the usual guns and axes and knives and blankets and all of this, he heavily went into plows and hoes, see, because then they'll farm. They'll trade, then we'll give them these farm implements, then they'll go out and farm, and they will assimilate into American culture. They didn't want to buy those materials. They went to the British, who were willing to sell them what they wanted. Then McKinney said, we also need perhaps to do some cultural work with the Indians. See, keeping in mind, if he were competing, he would go broke. But with the subsidy, he can keep hanging on year after year. He says, what we need to do is we need to have the Indians diversify a little bit. For example, he said he bought some, well, different kinds of culture. He bought Chinese Mandarin dresses for the Indians. And also bought 1,152 Jew's harps. I don't know if some of you know that Jew's harp. Yeah, the forerunner, kind of a forerunner of the harmonica, musical instrument. You can see the image here, the Indians out on the prairie surrounding the fire, their campfire, in their Chinese Mandarin dresses playing Jew's harps at night. The vision that our government subsidized company had. And so, not surprisingly, the Indians decided they didn't want to dress up in Chinese Mandarin dresses, play Jews' harps, buy the plows and hoes. And the British would have encroached, and it could have been some serious damage with the British presence militarily, especially with, they might be trading liquor and guns and all of this to the Indians. There could be some real problems out there on the frontier. Fortunately, a private entrepreneur, John Jacob Astor, came onto the scene. Out of New York, he said, I've got an idea that's better than anybody's had so far. I'm going to have my agents live with the Indians. My agents will have supplies of axes and knives, blankets, and whatever the Indians want. In fact, we'll find out what they want because our agents will live with them. Then when the Indians come in with their pelts, they won't have to go off to some fort. They'll trade right there with our agent, who will trade on the spot and then eventually get the pelts over to us. And so it's really a corporate innovation that Astor had that absolutely swept the government company away and swept the British away. So the United States was able to preserve its presence and dominate the Northwest Territory thanks to a private, unsubsidized entrepreneur who overcame the obstacles put in his path by the government. Now, by the way, the government entrepreneur, or Thomas McKinney rather, the political entrepreneur heading this company, tried to stop Astor by having Congress pass license fees for every one of his agents that would impose extra costs on them. See, so Astor had to work in Congress to try to stop the government company from imposing costs on him. Astor struck back, and on May 6th, 1822, a wonderful day in history. See, it's this month. It's something to celebrate. The Congress abolished all subsidies for the government company, and it went out of business. 192 years ago this month. May 6th. Some celebrate Cinco de Mayo. I'd like to celebrate Seis de Mayo. You know, you look at things like this. I know of no textbook that had this in it. I had a PhD in economic history and finally learned of this episode in history when I was about 50 years old. So I'd been teaching economic history, had a PhD in it, and finally ran across it. It virtually disappeared from the historical record. Yet, isn't something like this useful when we decide, should we have another government subsidy? Well, it made us pause a little bit. I'm going to go through just a couple here quickly. The steamship subsidy was the next. And the idea here, transatlantic steamship trade, we had improvements with the steamship over the sailing ship. We could cut down the time from 2 months to two weeks. And the idea was, do we need a government company to exploit this and to compete effectively with the British? So in the 1840s, 25 years after the fur company was abolished, we had a debate. And we thought, I wonder if there needs to be a government company. So we had a subsidized company. So we had a debate. A shipper named Edward Collins came to Congress to testify. And he said, yes, I firmly believe that a subsidy is needed to effectively do this trade. I strongly agree that Congress needs to get involved. Then he said something kind of interesting. He said, I volunteer to receive the subsidy. He did receive the subsidy. And in doing so, it was a disaster. He had 4 ships built. He had an initial subsidy of $385,000 a year. He had it increased steadily to over $800,000 a year. One of his ships sank. The government built him another one. They kept increasing his subsidy. In the midst of all this, Cornelius Vanderbilt had begun a privately operated steamship company, just as Astor had done, with no subsidy. And he was innovative, inventing third-class fares where he'd pack people in an area very tightly in order to cut down on the fares. He had the lowest fare of any, with no subsidy, from England to the United States, back and forth. And finally, Congress, after Collins had his second ship sink, hit an iceberg and sink, they abolished the subsidy and Collins went broke within the next year. We spent $11 million when our national debt was $60 million. $11 million of that was in steamship subsidies, and all the time we had Vanderbilt available to do it for nothing. Astor became the first American, John Jacob Astor, to be worth $10 million. Vanderbilt, the first American to be worth $100 million. Both of them start their career producing a superior product at a competitive price, competing against a government-subsidized competitor. We sure did learn our lesson for 4 years. Then we subsidized the Transcontinental railroads. We had a national debt, as I mentioned, of $60 million. We spent $60 million subsidizing transcontinental railroads. Abraham Lincoln even said of the Union Pacific, if you want twice the subsidies you're asking, I'll try to get it for you. The procedure for crossing the continent to connect the United States, we went from Omaha to California. And the idea was we'll pay by the mile, subsidy per mile. And what we found going through Nebraska, which is my home state, by the way, it's interesting, the Union Pacific is still a dominant force in the state. You're paying by the mile. So here's the way the railroad's going. Okay, railroad's coming along here. I'll go ahead east. Curving, because you get more money per mile. And so you try to stretch the railroad out as many miles as you can so you get as much subsidy as possible. I talked one time at a convention that had some Union Pacific people there, and one guy raised his hand and said, I worked my whole life for the Union Pacific, and a lot of what I did, they're still trying to straighten that railroad out 100 and some years later. And so the railroad did not do well. We had the invention of dynamite. The Union Pacific and Central Pacific, both of which had subsidies, ended up as they got close blowing up each other's railroad and then claiming money for the subsidy that the other side couldn't get money because it didn't complete the rail line because it got blown up in the night and that sort of thing. Finally, Congress got involved, said no more blowing up or we won't give anybody any more subsidies. Then the lines paralleled each other with both of them trying to get subsidies for all that. We ended up spending $60 million on the Union Pacific and Central Pacific, these two subsidized railroads. All the time we had James J. Hill, an immigrant, missing one eye. He wasn't going to receive some kind of disability insurance. He was off trying to build another transcontinental with no subsidy. From St. Paul to Seattle, Washington, he built the Great Northern Railroad with no federal subsidy. And when the Panic of 1893 came, the other transcontinentals fell into, some of them went into serious bankruptcy, others just really were reeling. But the Great Northern survived and did well. It was the best built of all the transcontinentals. So you have fur trade with steamships, railroads. One more I'd like to do, and then I want Anita to say some things, and that is with the airplane. Now, you might think, well, now in light of all these other failures, what would be the argument for an airplane? And the answer is that the Europeans, the argument here is, I know that the private enterprises worked and the subsidies have failed, but in this case, we need a subsidy because if we don't, the Europeans are going to invent the airplane because they're working on it. 1900. They'll invent it, they'll come over with bombs, they'll drop them on us, we will be obliterated. And there you are waiting for private enterprise to do something. We need to pick the guy who's the best, give him, in our country, who knows the most about aerodynamics. Give him that subsidy and let's invent this thing. They came upon Samuel Langley. He was a scientist and an inventor. He had already had a model airplane that he'd flown across the Potomac River. He was the president of the Smithsonian Institution. He had honorary degrees from Oxford, Cambridge, Harvard, and Yale. He had written a book on aerodynamics. And he, like Collins, volunteered to receive the subsidy. And he had a subsidy for 2 flights. And he had a theory of flight that said, because people thought it was unusual. You know, you think of a flight, you think, well, there's some kind of runway or maybe rolling it down a hill or something. He had it in the middle of a houseboat on the Potomac, his airplane. It was a catapult theory. The idea is it's like a big rubber band. You put that airplane in that, and then it just launches. And he said it's like ice skating, where on thin ice, an ice skater can go along without falling in until he stops. then the full weight comes and he falls. He says, the same theory of flight. You can go along and fly until you run out of gas, and then you stop. So the secret is just to have this enormous propulsion through the air, almost like a rocket, we would think today. And that was the theory with this catapult. You get the engines going, you're in the air, and then the engines go. And he told his pilot that on the first flight, try only to fly for 10 to 12 minutes. Learn all the landmarks in Washington. And before he had that first flight, 2 rockets went off to announce, here I am, here it comes. And that first flight, the catapult was launched. The subsidized airplane comes out. It crashes ignominiously into the Potomac. And the Washington Post is your newspaper of record. And they observed, they had witnesses, and they watched it. And here's what their chief story and their witness said. 13 words in the article. Any stout boy of 15 could have skimmed an oyster shell much farther. Well, he had one more flight. They fetched the pilot out of the water. He just about drowned, but they got him out and he agreed. They got the aerodrome out of the water. They dried it all off. They got the pilot ready, and they had enough for another flight. They pull back the catapult. The launch is out. Crash. The Boston Herald, their observer, their witness said, maybe Langley ought to abandon airplanes and turn his attention to submarines. The New York Times said, I don't think we're going to have the invention of an airplane for another 1 million years. Well, they were off. They were off by 999 years, 356 days. 9 days after the failure, we're going to have a successful flight. Anita's going to talk about that. She wanted me to talk about Langley. She gets to talk about the one that worked. Go ahead.
By the way, I should introduce Anita. She is a history professor also at Hillsdale College. She served in the Electoral College in 1988. Since 2006, she has directed Hillsdale College's Free Market Forum, a national colloquium for college teachers. She is co-author with Burt of FDR Goes to War, and has written frequently for the Wall Street Journal, American Spectator, Human Events, and the Detroit News. So Anita, thanks for being here.
Thank you, Steve. Yes, I get the happy story of all this saga, because Langley's attempts were so widely publicized. At the time, in 1900, Langley would, if he had contemporary press that we have today, he would have been on the cover of People magazine and all of this press, because the big story throughout the world was, how can man fly? Everybody was trying to figure that out. And here was a man in his 30s out in Dayton, Ohio, Wilbur Wright. He'd been in a hockey accident playing ice hockey when he was a teenager, and had lost a lot of teeth playing in this hockey game, and then some sort of infection set in, or sickness, and he was sick much of his 20s, never went to college, but a very, very brilliant man. And his father was a minister, so he stayed home and helped his father print the ministerial news that he wrote, the newspaper. And then his younger brother, Orville, also did not go to college. They stayed in Dayton. Neither one married, lived very quietly at home, always the minister's sons. They didn't smoke or drink or chew tobacco, nothing like that, and dressed very formally. Those pictures you see of the Wrights with the high, stiff collars and the ties, that's how they dressed all the time. But Wilbur became fascinated with the talk on how can we fly. And he developed a very scientific approach. He had the mind for it, and he began reading everything he could find. He even wrote Samuel Langley. And of course, this was just one of many letters that Samuel Langley received over at the Smithsonian, and one of Langley's assistants sent Wilbur Wright a response, and that was the first contact they had. But Wilbur began studying flight, and soon Orville was interested as well. And one of the things they read, some of the advice they received from scientists was, learn about birds. Watch the flight of birds. How do they fly? How do they angle their wings? Study everything in nature that you can about flying. And the Wrights took this to heart, and plus they were spending their own money. Now that's a profound thing. When you're spending your own money, and they're just bike mechanics. They have a bicycle repair shop. Their busy season, of course, is the spring and the summer. But in the fall and the winter, they didn't have much to do. So they worked in their bike repair shop, and early on, they built a 6-foot-long, very crude wind tunnel. They had a fan at one end, and they found that they could experiment with the different shapes of wings. How do you shape a wing? Is it better curved or is it better straight? And what is the optimal length when you have a certain weight on a craft? Langley hadn't studied any of this. He had just gone with the big motor and the heavy contraption. I wouldn't even call it an airplane. It was a sort of a flying contraption that he was with this launch. But the Wrights really studied the effects of all this and did some fascinating scientific experiments. One of the things they had to work on was how do you build a propeller that would go through the air efficiently. And they covered 5 notebooks full of mathematical diagrams and drawings. No one knew how to build a good propeller. And if you look at a propeller, you don't just stick a nail, through a 2x4 and let it spin. That's not going to work. But you have to curve a propeller, and there's a little bit of a twist to a propeller. Well, they experimented and experimented with that to try to get one that was efficient. Finally, they were ready, and another piece of advice they had received was build a glider and really first take it in steps. Learn how to fly a glider. That makes a lot of sense to us now. Because if you think about it, nothing was developed. There was not a landing gear for a glider. A lot of men in Europe had experimented with all kinds of gliding machines. You sometimes see those on documentaries, and often they are crashing. They jump off of these high hills and glide. The problem was the landing. And significantly, even some of the men who wrote Orville and Wilbur Wright, they died while they were experimenting on these gliders. It was a very dangerous business. But the Wrights built their first glider, and it had to be taken apart and be able to put back together because they had to ship it on the train. So they shipped their glider parts out to North Carolina, and they were going to do their first experiments at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina in 1900. And why did they go to Kitty Hawk? Kitty Hawk was really a very bleak area. It was just one little village back before the popularity of summer resorts. People didn't go to North Carolina to the beach that much, and Kitty Hawk was a very poor area, but it had high winds that were very steady, and it was remote. No one was going to steal any of the ideas that the Wrights had. They wanted to be able to patent whatever they came up with. So property rights was a big incentive to them as well. They knew they could patent their invention. They go out to Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, and of course to the locals, they're a very odd pair. You have these men, and very polite. They were very good with the children in the village, very polite to the women in the village. But they're living in a tent out in the sand dunes, and they have this contraption. They keep jumping off the sand dunes and gliding around, and sometimes crashing in small crashes in their glider. So the locals get to know the Wright brothers, and every fall in 1900, 01, 02, the Wrights go back to Kitty Hawk with more experiments on their gliders. So they're learning a lot. They learned that it worked a lot better to have a mechanism on the tail that you could move, because then you could guide the machine a little better. They had to learn what to do in gusty winds. And one of their differences with Samuel Langley also was Samuel Langley said, well, we'll learn to fly, and we just won't fly on windy days. And Wilbur Wright said, well, the problem with that is the wind usually blows. That could be a problem with domestic flying on a regular basis. So, of course, you came to the big day, December 1903, and the Wrights are back out at Kitty Hawk, and this time they've developed a motor. Again, just on private initiative, they had looked everywhere, and so had Langley, for a lightweight motor that would be at least 8 horsepower and weigh less than 200 pounds. And they finally went to one of the men in their bicycle shop. They knew they're in Dayton, and said, do you think you can build this? And he said, sure, I'll give it a try. And so with parts in the bicycle shop and a few things they bought, he put together a really first-class, lightweight motor. He didn't even keep drawings of his first motor. He just did it tinkering around with it. He had no prototype, no drawings for posterity to look at. The Wrights put his motor on their glider and thought it would work very well, shipped it all to North Carolina. We're out there in December of 1903, 9 days after Samuel Langley's second crash into the Potomac. And their craft is so crude, their glider still. Remember, they had kind of a skid type of thing that they would roll down or slide down in order to launch the glider. But they had to go get some men from the nearby lighthouse to help them push this machine up the hill. So every time they launched it, they had to push it back up this large sand dune. Pushed it up the sand dune, and there were 5 or 6 men pushing it up there, and then when they had the signal, they let it go, and they started their motor. And Wilbur had tried the first flight, and it didn't go well. So Orville, then they made some adjustments. Orville tried the second one, and suddenly Orville Wright was in the air. And the men watching them were just these villagers, and they were just astounded. One of them, named Johnny Moore, was so excited. He was just a young guy, 18 or 19. He ran back to Kitty Hawk and said, they done it, damned if they ain't flew. And that was the entire coverage they got of the event, because there were no news people there. So they did have you've seen the photographs. They had a photograph of Orville at that time lying prone on the plane and up in the air. But for the next 5 years, it took them 5 years then to perfect what they were doing, and they were attacked all the time as lying, because people kept saying they didn't really fly, they haven't really done this. Because before they left Kitty Hawk, after that first successful flight, they spent several days doing more flights, and at one point Wilbur Wright flew over 800 feet, which was really quite good. But the next summer, they decided they would just stay in Dayton. And they even showed their congressman, and guess what the congressman did, and they wanted him to? He wrote the government, he wrote the Department of Defense, at that time it would be called Department of War, and said, you know, I have these constituents, and they have built a flying machine, and it works. And what did the Department of War do? They ignored the whole thing and refused to give them any real credence that they had done this. One of the things the Wrights had to do in 1904 and 1905, if you think about it, is they had to learn, how do you fly in a circle? You can't just continually fly in a straight line, you know, or you're going to end up in Timbuktu somewhere. So they had to learn how to circle their aircraft. That takes a lot of different wires and a tail that moves, and how do you manage it, and how do you land safely without killing yourself. It's just impractical if you can't land. And they were getting better and better at this. And they put wheels on the bottom of it and learned how to do that. Finally, they kept talking to the American government, wanting the American government to buy they called it the Wright Flyer. And the Department of War was fascinated not with the Wright Flyer, but with aerial balloons that they would just send up and, you know, observe things on balloons with ropes. They tried that, though, during the Spanish-American War, and the Spanish just shot it full of holes and then knew where the Americans were and bombed the area where the ground crew was. So that didn't work. The Wrights, instead, they have an investment here. By this time, they've spent quite a bit of their own money on this thing, and they haven't made any money on it. So they finally go to the French government. And the French government, with watching the Germans across the Rhine and all that they were doing in 1904 and 5, 6, and 7 to build up militarily, the French are quite interested, but they want proof. So in 5 years after their original flight, Wilbur Wright packs up the crates of their improved airplane, ships it to France, and he is attacked in the press. The French call him a bluffeur. You know, he's a bluffer. He's a fake. But finally, he gets his plane put back together with the help of an assistant, and on August the 7th, 1908, and that's another memorable date, he's finally airborne over French soil. And as we write in Uncle Sam Can't Count, the onlookers were amazed as Wilbur executed a perfect figure 8, which is hard to do, with the grace of a bird on the wing. A local journalist, French journalist, who knew something about the problems of aviation was transfixed as Wilbur's flight continued. And this journalist wrote, "To behold this flying machine turn sharp round at the edge of the wood and continue on its course is an enchanting spectacle," he reported. "The wind does not seem to trouble him." And then at the same time, Orville, it was nice having two brothers, and they both could fly by this time. Orville had a similar Wright flyer, and he was going to fly it for the Department of War at long last. He got a hearing out in Virginia, and Orville is at Fort Myer, Virginia, with an airplane that same year. And as Orville took off, and there were lots of spectators at Orville's event, a local reporter from the Washington Star heard a long, indrawn breath from the crowd. Orville also turned the plane to circle over the field. Some in the crowd wept as they realized the accomplishment they had just witnessed. Man had conquered the air. And it was. It was a fantastic accomplishment with only about $2,000 of their own money. Two bike mechanics from Dayton, Ohio, had invented the airplane. They had also come up with a propeller, a wooden propeller, that was over 80% efficient. And even now, with computerized models, the best we can do is about an 85% efficient propeller. So their propeller was brilliant. And they are the ultimate example, I believe, of why government should not try to pick winners and losers. You just can't do it. You don't know who is going to come forward and prove to be really the genius of the moment. And in 1903, it was Wilbur and Orville Wright.
Amazing. Wow. Well, thank you. That was fascinating. So what happened? Did they get rich?
I should have added, Burt loves, he wants me to ask a question, which he's brilliant at in his speeches. The government, after all that demonstration, had the option of, in 1904, right after the Wrights flew the first time, funding Langley, buying more balloons, or buying the Wright flyer. And I already told you.
Langley asked for more funding. He said it was a launching mechanism error. And he said, "I will not receive private support. It's the people's airplane, the nation's." So we had a choice to fund Langley.
You go ahead.
Or the balloon.
Or the balloons, which the balloons are Bert's favorite. He loves that balloon story. And they went for the balloons.
But we often ask that of the crowd. And they went for the balloons. But then when that didn't work and they had a choice between Wright and Langley, then we ask another one, and the crowd is, "Oh, no, no, no." But they did choose Wright. They didn't back Langley.
And they did buy the Wright flyer.
The military did.
The military did for $25,000, and the Wrights began selling their airplanes, yes.
For private
privately.
commercial.
And they did make some money.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
How many have heard of these stories in school? Now, Tiffany's heard some, but how many have heard?
No.
We heard what Orville and Wilbur's father had to say about it.
Yeah.
Yes.
Wow. So does that company, whatever happened to that company that they established, did it become successful?
Yeah, Curtiss Wright. They merged ultimately with Glenn Curtiss. It was a successful company. And now the Curtiss company, I think, does engine parts. So, but it's interesting because with the churning effect, for example, the Boeing came along and figured out how to do these seaplanes. So they were really the most competitive with commercial
Seaplanes.
flights and mail delivery. Yeah, where you'd land on
Right,
that.
sure.
And the Boeings actually outcompeted the Wrights by the 1920s. I mean, the point is, you can't then make the mistake and say, aha, we've got the winner. Now let's just plug it into the Wrights. Because there were other entrepreneurs who were going to supersede the Wrights. The Wrights were great inventors,
Right.
but Wilbur died in 1912, and Orville didn't have all the elements.
So did they get patents for all
Yep,
their?
they did.
Yes, some.
Right.
But from 1908 until his death in 1912, Wilbur spent a lot of time having to fight invasions on their patents.
Really?
But they did get tremendous recognition.
Right.
Wilbur is an interesting figure because his health was never fantastic. He just didn't seem to have a very good constitution. And sure enough, in 1912, he was off on a business trip with all of this about the patents and the company. And he was not feeling well, and by the time he arrived home, the doctor diagnosed typhoid fever. And he had typhoid fever, and he died.
Mm.
And after he died, Orville was a great companion with Wilbur, and together they made a great team, but Orville wasn't a spark plug.
We thought that this audience here would be most interested in the historical subsidies, because once you've gone this far, the question is, hey, because we have a chapter on green energy,
Sure.
we have a chapter on the DC subsidy machine, which set up the Export-Import Bank, and gave, through the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, the first welfare program. So you have offshoots then, and you go from having Congress subsidize people to having a board do subsidies. But our point would be, given the historical record, we should never have gone in that direction. And the modern ones with Solyndra, we have a discussion of Solyndra. The ethanol subsidies, where then the innovators come in with fracking, so we really didn't have the oil shortage that was argued in the 1970s. The experts all said we only have 10 years. Jimmy Carter said 10 years.
Barack
maybe.
Obama said that 3 years ago. I was interested in your discussion about the transcontinental railroads, because I think most Americans would view that as a big success. And are you arguing that this was a misallocation of tax dollars? Because I think the conventional wisdom is just the opposite, that this was a public works program that really unified the country. And so.
Right, and we see that even today. You'll see people cite the Union Pacific as an example of, hey, let's get some high-speed rail and all of this. One thing to keep in mind, usually you have a successful export, and then the transportation follows from the successful export. You don't have the transportation going out somewhere and then economic development follows. And so there's a miscalculation with that. But in any case, even putting that completely aside, the idea was we can go through with a federally subsidized Transcontinental. And we had Lincoln picked Grenville Dodge, and he picked some of the best railroad minds of the day. But when the incentives are wrong, and you're paying people, you're not doing a quality control on the rail, you're paying by the mile, and you're going right into Indian territory where they didn't have, where there were massacres that occurred of the people building the rail line. But they had to do it because they're being paid by the mile. So that gives them an incentive to reach in and build in perilous territory. So we had a rail line that ultimately didn't work because they didn't go up the mountains properly. So the Union Pacific had to be completely rebuilt before you could go across the country.
All right, well, let's just open this up to questions. John?
Sure.
One thing for sure, at least the high-speed rail would not be on a curving path. Perhaps.
We think.
Perhaps. I'm curious, too, our good friend Larry Reed always points out President Cleveland, who I believe is the one who vetoed the appropriation to fund the purchase of Mount Vernon under the theory that that was not under the authority of the federal government an appropriate purchase. I'm curious in all of your subsidies, what were some ringing subsidies they refused, or did they just decide everything out there was fair game and we ought to subsidize whatever, depending on who had paid for their election?
Well, after the problems with the transcontinental railroads, there was a period, and Grover Cleveland is part of that, where the public finally understood what a mess subsidies do. And this is in the period after the Civil War, and we had huge economic development, and obviously a lot of problems as cities grew and we had the industrialized parts of the United States. But the American people didn't want subsidies. After that generation understood. But then subsequent generations, what we're finding is you have to educate every generation about the problems of subsidies and the problems they cause.
Part of progressivism?
Right, we had 28 years of budget surpluses and very few subsidies in the period after the Civil War. But right, the progressive era comes along. That's partly where we get the airplane subsidy. We have a chapter on Herbert Dow. He received no subsidies. I mean, he's part of that late 1800s. And his competitors in France and Germany and Britain were receiving subsidies. And we show how he beats them. That's kind of a happy chapter. We're not giving the subsidies. The other countries are giving the subsidies, and their companies are having problems because of that. And the United States chemical industry is born in that environment. Yes, sir.
I'm Dino Drudy, an economist, but also one who pays attention to American history and am sort of partial to the Whigs. And the Whig Party, one of its key tenets was public works, of which these kind of subsidies would be a subset. And the Republican Party inherited, lock, stock, and barrel, the Whigs' economic program. It even forced the Free Soil Party to abandon their economic program, which was more like the Democrats in those days. To what extent is this, and even the things Barack Obama is doing with these subsidies, a legacy of the Whigs?
I think it is. The Whig Party, and even the Democrats to some extent, had a lot of state-funded railroads. For example, Michigan had state-funded railroads and canals. They were done by the Democratic Party, but the Whig Party supported it. The Whig parties were built on that idea of internal improvements, and I think it's interesting to look at the states where those developments took place. Some, like Ohio, others, passed laws saying, after we did the experiment, and after they failed, saying, our state can never again invest in these internal improvements. There were so many failures. And so, yeah, it's not a very good record. We talk about the National Road, which is kind of one of the first road subsidies that was done under Thomas Jefferson. And it was a big failure, too. In fact, it was built to try to pave the way for Western settlement into the Louisiana Territory. It was so poorly done, and people, because it was publicly owned, nobody owned it. Nobody had a stake in preserving it, so people would steal the stone off the road. And it was partly done for mail delivery, but it was so poorly executed that people along the road had to have private couriers to deliver the mail, because on the mail road, it was so incompetently done. So, yes, a lot of these subsidies were rejected, but you're absolutely right. William Seward, governor of New York, even promoted the Erie Canal, and he promoted the Transcontinental Railroad. It goes right from the Whigs to the Republican Party. And Herbert Hoover started the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which had a board to give out subsidies. So, yes, there is a strong political connection, Whigs and Republicans.
And what's more troubling is that the government has been doing this for nearly the entirety of American history for so long and so consistently. Would you argue that it is so much a part of the political fabric, succeed or fail, that it would be almost impossible to get rid of it?
No, I'm always optimistic, and Anita is too.
Yes?
I think that people can learn from history, and I think we did. After the failure of the Transcontinentals, we went through a whole generation where subsidies were pretty much off the table. You did have occasional protective tariffs, which are a sort of subsidy, but you did not. With the steel industry, the chemical industry, variety of industries, you simply didn't have federal subsidies. And coincidentally, America launches into becoming a world power during that time period. That generation learned. In fact, again, the airplane subsidy, for it to get in, they had to overcome. Now, wait a minute. It's a failure. But we simply stop teaching these lessons from the past. You say, how can you stop it? If people are saying, should we have a subsidy? And then all of this stuff's off the table. Well, we're going to take all of these examples, fur trade, all of this off the table, this Transcontinental's, the airplane. We're going to take all the disasters by the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which ended up giving subsidies to the guy who headed the corporation, to his bank, which subsequently went broke. We're going to take that off the table. We're going to take Solyndra off the table. We're going to take the oil crisis. We have an oil crisis, therefore we have to subsidize ethanol. It's expensive, there are unintended consequences, and then we develop hydraulic fracking and horizontal drilling, and now we have 200 years of oil supply. Well, let's take that off the table. Then, yeah, you'll make bad decisions. But if you come into a public policy arena and you have these examples, and they go out, and then the other side goes in, and you have a debate on the merits of the argument, I think you're going to get a different conclusion.
So we're having a big debate now in Washington. You mentioned the Export-Import Bank, and also with this group, OPIC. And the companies basically make this argument that, we're kind of unilaterally disarming if we don't do this, because France and Germany and China and Japan are using these same subsidies for their industries. Right. What would you tell the senators and Congress?
Sure. We have 10 pages on the Export-Import Bank because it was a spin-off from an agency set up to make subsidies, and then the Export-Import Bank comes in. The first subsidies we trace were disasters in the 1930s. We ended up giving a subsidy to Cuba to build roads when our own WPA was a total failure, our own road building program. But we did it because we had a protective tariff on their sugar, and it ruined their sugar industry, so they kind of said, you owe us. So then we'll give them a subsidy for their roads. Then they wouldn't pay us back, and then the other Central American countries, Latin American countries wanted subsidies too, and Cuba wanted another subsidy. Now, the Export-Import Bank is quick to argue, as Steve just said, that, oh, well, a lot of them are paying back their loans now, and it would help some of these industries develop. Jeb Henserling is a very, very knowledgeable person. I really like the position he's taking, and he's making the point, number one, when you help subsidize some of these businesses, others go without the subsidy, so you're really picking winners and losers. Although, as we've seen, you're picking losers and losers more often. Second, Boeing ends up, of the loans that go out on the Export-Import Bank, has gotten over half of the loans, one company, for several years now. One year it was up to 78%, something like that. But it's still over 50% of the specific loans. Boeing has a backlog that goes back to is up to 2019. Now, if they have a backlog of buyers to 2019, do they really need subsidies to go compete against Airbus overseas? They say, well, Airbus is subsidized. Well, but you don't, a subsidy, as we've often seen, can promote inefficiencies. That's why we have the Dow chapter. He was unsubsidized, competing against subsidized people, and beat them. Maybe that's going to make Airbus inefficient because it's relying on the subsidies. In any case, Airbus doesn't compete in China, in Central America, other places where you can compete without a subsidy problem. So I'm not really sure they're needed, and in any case, the Export-Import Banks like to say, well, we tend to do okay. Most of these loans get paid back. Well, then let the private sector do it. That's what we did before. And then they gauge the relative risk by the interest rate. And that's the way the market takes care of these things. If it's a good deal, then a bank will emerge that will come up with a good interest rate, and you can do the deal.
We have time for one more question. Anybody? Yeah. Let me ask one last thing on the internet. I don't know. I didn't get all the way through the book. I got halfway through it. The proponents of subsidies say that Al Gore invented the internet, the Defense Department really launched this whole new era of the digital age, and I wonder if you have thoughts about that.
Well, what comes back at us often in question and answer period is the internet question or the Manhattan Project question.
Or NASA, maybe.
NASA.
Right.
All of those, and we look at those. Some of that is in the area of national defense. And in the book, we have the one that we tackle is the Manhattan Project. And we feel that that was something obviously of a success, but part of it we think is due to the fact of the secrecy of the Manhattan Project. The political vultures couldn't even find it because so few people knew it was there.
That's interesting.
And the other thing is Leslie Groves, the commanding officer, evidently was a very ethical man, ran a very tight ship. And he, in effect, reminds me of Commodore Vanderbilt and his steamship, similar personalities. But with the internet, yes, you know, I guess the Department of Defense began the internet, but surely someone with computers was going to think that up. And it didn't really take off until Microsoft and Apple and the private sector really got in there and went with it. That's when it really, really took off and became a viable working tool that was greatly convenient for everybody. So, if that answers your question.
Fantastic. Well, thank you. Thank you very much for being here this morning, and looking
Thank you
forward
for
to lunch.
coming.
Thank you.